If you've got some cash lying around in your checking account or maybe in some investments, is it worth using that cash to pay off your debts, or should you keep investing? I'm really excited to talk about this today. I feel like it's one of the questions of the soul with regard to finance. It's one of those things that everybody's thought of at some point. What is the right thing to do? The problem is that without a crystal ball, we're never going to know which route of action is going to pan out the best. It can be difficult to part with investments that are performing well, but we also don't want to be in debt longer than we have to and accrue additional interest. To properly answer this question, we're going to have to position ourselves at the intersection of statistical probability and common sense. In the name of combating clickbait, there's a very simple and general answer that I can give to this question. You should typically not pay off your debt early, as long as the investments are going to make a higher rate of return than the debt is accruing in interest. It doesn't really even matter the dollar amounts. You can have a large amount of debt and a small amount of investments, and it would still make sense to keep the debt as long as those investments are growing at a rate faster than the debt, generally speaking. The huge caveat here is obviously that there's a lot of nuance to this, and today I'm going to talk about where that nuance lies and how you can make a better, more informed decision as to what's going to be the best for your individual situation. At the end, I'll also show you some spreadsheets and graphs so that you can get a better intuitive visual picture about what these things look like in real dollars and cents examples. The first big major point of nuance that I want to talk about is the cognitive bias of overconfidence. In today's information age, knowledge is disseminated over the internet basically instantly. There's no real competitive edge that you could have in terms of knowing something that other people don't know. We're all pretty much on the same playing field. And the same is true with other technical things as well. Developing algorithms, trying to trade your way into higher returns is largely a thing of the past. Especially as AI pans out and algorithms are developing themselves, I think it's going to be really difficult for any average person to gain any sort of competitive advantage in the stock market. The reason that I bring this up is even though those competitive advantages are largely gone, it doesn't stop people from thinking that they have a competitive advantage or that they are a great investor. And overconfidence, interestingly enough, tends to have an inverse correlation with investing performance. People that think that they're really good investors and traders are often not. This type of person tends to misgauge information, overreact, overcompensate, and take on an excessive risk profile, not fully understanding what it means. The second big point of nuance that you probably saw coming from a mile away is the risk profile. Most people, and I say this as a financial advisor that talks to hundreds of people per year about their finances, most people fundamentally do not understand risk. I talk to people all the time that say, I did better than the market. I got a rate of return higher than what the S&P provided. Well, yeah, you took on more risk than the S&P has exposure to, and you just happen to be right. What goes up must come down. If you have the potential to make a lot of money, you almost always have the potential to lose a lot of money. And to be fair, of course, stocks have a wide range of risk, right? If you have a mortgage at 3% and you're telling me you don't want to sell your Procter & Gamble stock because you think it's going to do better than 3%, I'd say, yeah, that's probably fine. But if you're telling me that you don't want to sell your QQQ NASDAQ 100 to pay off like a 10% car note or something, I'm probably going to very politely tell you that you're off your rocker. The other thing is there's a lot of survivorship bias in stocks. When you're looking at history, you're often looking at the ones that made it through history, right? I could show you a fund that's 50% Monster Energy and 50% Nvidia, and it'd be like, whoa, this guy's a stock picking genius. High risk profile. But what happens if this is 20 years ago, 25 years ago, what if I'm trying to pick the two best stocks and the ones that I just happen to pick are Lehman Brothers and AIG, right? We don't know going forward what the winners are going to be. You really only know in hindsight. So it doesn't make sense to try to speculate on who the winners are going to be going forward. It's not really fair to say, I don't want to sell my Nvidia position to pay off this 7 or 8% interest debt. If it's Coca-Cola stock, sure, whatever. That's a proven company. Consumer staples, does well in a recession. Fine, whatever. Let's take a chance on fate. It's the more trendy or unproven or expensive businesses that get me kind of nervous and saying, well, maybe let's just pay off the debt to be safe. People always say, well, the S&P gets 8.5% per year on average, so as long as I'm in it for the long term, then I'm fine, as long as my debt is less than 8.5%. But if you are talking about a car note, for example, you're not a long-term investor by definition. Your time horizon is sort of limited to the car note. There are plenty of 5-year periods that you can find in the S&P 500 where from point 0 to the end of year 5, it was down 15-20% over that time period. So that's the nightmare situation that I keep saying you want to avoid, is because what happens if over that 5-year period you don't pay a dime more than you have to, so you accrue the maximum possible amount of interest for that loan, and your investments get a 15-20% haircut over that period as well. That's a pretty massive lose-lose, and if your financial health isn't in a situation where you can support that kind of speculative loss, I would say let's not expose ourselves to that kind of speculative loss in the first place. Third point of nuance is credit. This one's a pretty small one, but if you know you're going to be making a big purchase in the near future, a home or a car, it might make sense to pay off certain debts just to get your credit score up a bit, because your credit score does have a massive impact on the interest rates that you're going to be able to get on your loan. So in some situations, that might make sense. For more information on how credit works, make sure that you watch this video on our channel about credit hacking. Fourth point of nuance is tax, and this one's a pretty big one. You got to know what the tax implications are of the decision that you're going to make. If you've got a lot of capital gains to pay on some stock and you're going to have to sell it in order to pay off the debt, especially if that debt is a mortgage, you kind of wonder if you're getting into a situation where you're going to have to pay capital gains tax in order to pay off a debt, the interest of which is tax deductible. You kind of wonder if you're getting into a situation where you're cutting off the nose to spite the face. Obviously, accruing interest isn't a good thing in and of itself. We're not happy to be having mortgage interest, but if we're going to have it, it's nice that you can write it off. So it is something to be conscious of. And especially, heaven forbid, if you're ever thinking about taking money out of a 401k or an IRA, taking the penalty and paying all of that tax as ordinary income to pay off a debt that the interest is tax deductible, then I would say we're really entering into some dangerous territory from the tax perspective. But it could make sense. Depends on the situation. Fifth big point of nuance is an emergency fund. Not having an emergency fund is an emergency. So we're not going to use the emergency fund to pay off the debt, even if the debt is a higher interest rate. What I see happen a lot when people don't listen to this point of advice is some emergency will come up and then they don't have any cash on hand to pay for the emergency, so they need to take out credit card debt or other high interest rate debt in order to finance that emergency, and they end up paying a lot more interest than they would have paid in the first place if they had just kept their emergency fund. That's what it's for. And the last big point of nuance, I kind of hinted at this already, but it's your financial situation, the future outlook specifically of your financial situation. If your income is choppy, inconsistent, or you're not sure what the future is going to look like, I would be very careful about making any sort of speculations. If you're debating holding onto your stock and your income situation is not very solid, I would definitely lean towards the more conservative side of that bet. But if your income is growing, or if you're getting bonuses, or if you know that you're going to have a bonus coming, actually, no, I wouldn't say if you know that you're going to have a bonus coming, because I've seen many situations where people make financial decisions counting on a future income stream or a bonus or something like that happening, and then for whatever reason they get fired or laid off or something right before the bonus, and now they're way worse off because they were treating it as if it was a guaranteed thing. I wouldn't make decisions until you have the money in hand, but it's something to consider. Your future income outlook, maybe you can lean a little bit towards, if you've got room to speculate, by all means go for it. But I do think it's important to not kid yourself. I think you have to have a real talk with yourself and say, okay, I know that I'm making on paper a bad decision. It might work out in my favor, but it could just as easily work out against me. So don't kid yourself. That's all I'll say about that. And here is the best part of everybody's day, spreadsheets. My colleagues at Venrate.com and I programmed this little scenario generator to show you what these different scenarios would look like. In all of them, you start with $200,000 of debt and you have $100,000 of cash on hand. In all of these scenarios, you also have an income surplus of $12,000 per year that grows at 2% with inflation, and that will go automatically towards debt unless the debt hits zero, at which point it will go into the investment fund. So we'll start with scenario 4. We kept the investments that were earning only 5% instead of using them to pay off debt at 8%. We end the scenario with a net worth of $600,000, and even though our net worth is going up, the rate of change is negative, and if we kept this projection going past 50 years, the net worth would eventually turn around and start dropping as the debt snowballs and we never really get in control of it. In scenario 3, we sold the investments, which was sad, but the investments were earning less. This was one of those 5% investments, 8% debt scenarios. So selling was a bummer, but it did allow us to start with only $100,000 of debt. That made it a lot easier to pay off, which we finally did after 13 years. And we started building an investment portfolio back after we paid off the debt, and it got a pretty good ramp up before ending the scenario at $2.07 million net worth. In scenario 2, we sold off $100,000 of investments that were earning 8% to pay off debt that was accruing interest at 5%, which is a bummer. but it did allow us to get out of debt relatively quickly in only 10 years, which I would add is 3 years faster than in scenario 3. We ended the scenario with $4.76 million, so double what we had in scenario 3, more than double. In scenario 1, we kept our investments that were earning 8%, and we started with the full $200,000 of debt. It's slightly unintuitive because in this scenario, we were in debt for the second longest length of time, the only one longer being scenario 4, in which we never got out of debt even after 50 years. Scenario 1, we were in debt for 24 years. Despite this, our $100,000 of investments were growing faster than the debt was, so our net worth was still rising exponentially, and we finished the scenario at the highest by far with $6.53 million. So you can see what I mean, that the answer that makes the most financial sense isn't always the first thought. It seems like 24 years in debt as opposed to only 10 would be much worse, but in reality, because those investments are growing at a faster rate than the debt, it's much, much better. You could make the argument, though, that scenario 1 was the more speculative, as it required assuming that those investments would make 8%. And as I already talked about verbosely, that's not always a guaranteed assumption, especially when you're working with equities. So in summary, be smart, be informed, and don't kid yourself. Thanks for watching Venrate on YouTube. Be sure to like, subscribe, and send this video to your friend that has the most debt. Also, be sure to check out venrate.com for the world's best financial calculators and planning tools.